Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, Children's Mental Health, How Sponsors Can Support Newcomer Kids and Families. Go on to the next slide, please. Some housekeeping here in a second, sorry. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the U.S. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there's a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. Please use that questions pane as opposed to the chat. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can try to assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And this brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Leslie Cashin, a licensed marriage and family therapist with Cashin Creative Counseling. Leslie, welcome, and I'll let you take it away from here.
Thank you, Derek. Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie. I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. And I have a private practice in Lexington, Kentucky. I don't currently work with any refugees, but I have in the past worked with refugees through Kentucky Refugee Ministries, where I provided in-home care with families and children, and I specialize in working with families and children in general. So this makes me uniquely suited to be able to talk about mental health and children, especially when it comes to newcomers to our country. So if we could go ahead to our first slide, that would be great. Or our second slide, that would also be great. Thank you so much. So why is this important for us to discuss? So people who interact with newcomers or refugees in America are in a position to be able to help them uniquely as they are getting used to our culture and coming to this new place, and with the challenges of that are, you know, the usual ones of what's a social security card and how do I ride the bus and all of those normal things. There's also the mental health challenges that both the adults and all family members experience, but also the children, their mental health and their experience, and the unique part of their experience, which is to grow up in two cultures or be born in America, experiencing one culture at home and one culture everywhere else in their life. And so we're going to talk about that today and why that's important for us to be able to support them through and what we can do to help their mental health in this time for them. First of all, I want to recognize our positions of power and support. A lot of us come from a place of privilege where we are, you know, kind of helping and walking people along the way, but also we are used to, for better or for worse, used to America and some of the society issues that may come up for us and that we may know how to walk through, and families and children may not know how to walk through or not know how that would impact them mentally. And so it's really important to recognize our own experience and our own positions while we talk about this, and then the ways that we can support them. We can't speak to all experiences, and even as you work with refugee families and children from different cultures all over the world, maybe you only work with children and families that are from the Middle East, or maybe you only work with people from a certain part of Africa or something like that. Each experience is still unique, even if they come from a similar place or have had similar stories. So it's really important to understand that. Through this conversation, we're seeking to be aware of the symptoms of mental health stress. Excuse me, Kentucky allergies. We're seeking to be aware of the symptoms of mental health stress to better support the families and kiddos. We're not here to diagnose anyone. That is not your job as a support person unless you are a mental health professional and they are seeking your support in that way, and that is between you and that family. But otherwise, we might see something that we will go on to discuss what we might see, but that's not your job to diagnose what it might be. And as we said, each family and culture has a unique experience. They also have a unique relationship with mental health. And so some cultures, and we'll talk some more about this, but as we discuss the importance of cross-cultural sensitivity, some cultures, mental health is not a thing. That's not something they may have ever experienced or discussed before. And for some, it might look entirely different than it looks here in America. So it's important to understand our own life stance and circumstance to try to understand theirs when addressing mental health symptoms. Next slide, please. As is true for all children, the formative experiences of being a newcomer child or children will be shaped by interactions between the child and their environment. The systems within which children and youth are embedded shape their opportunities with important implications both for educational as well as well-being outcomes. Before us, we see what's called the ecological model or the ecological perspective. And this is a highly influential model of child development that argues that children are profoundly impacted by various intersecting levels of their physical and social environments. At the most intimate microsystemic level, you see families. That's this blue spot in the middle. You see families, peers, and school playing an important role in daily interactions. That seems like a no-brainer, right? This would be extra stressful if there's loss of family or separation from family or a lack of peers or struggling in school, right? So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about that very specific, highly influential level of perspective. The next one out at the next level are outside influences that may not have direct contact with the child, but definitely impact their experience. This would be like their family's work conditions, where their parents work, if their parents work, what kind of work that they might have. Do they work long hours? Are they hardly ever home? Are they stressed out at work? And then also the places that they live, their communities or lack thereof. What kind of neighborhood do they live in? Are they in community with people that look and sound like them and have similar life experiences in them, or are they feeling isolated and alone? At the most macro systemic level, we have economic, policy, or legal conditions that have profound indirect repercussions on children's lives. All of these levels of the ecosystem are not separate, but interact and can have implications with one another. And that outer one is, our economic systems. What kind of socioeconomic place do they have in the world, or does their family have a place in the world? How are they interacting with their new culture versus their old culture? What kind of laws are impacting them? And so those are important things to think about when we are thinking about mental health stresses on children and families, that these are all the layers that we're dealing with. All right. And all children grow within cultural contexts that shape their future selves. And for newcomer children, some critical individual characteristics shaping the development are the child's age at migration, race and ethnicity, literacy in their home language and in English, exposure to trauma, sexual orientation, and temperament. These are all things to consider when we look at the ecological perspective. Next slide, please. So, like many children in the US, experiencing mental health struggles is not something new. I'm sure you either have children or know of children or have experienced children or your own self and know that mental health stress is something that happens for us. Many children in the US experience mental health concerns because of the political climate, the culture, or their own family struggles. And newcomer children have these same experiences with a highlighter of their own experiences of being refugees or newcomers. So some general mental health youth stress that you might see in children that you know or in newcomer children are anxiety, depression, PTSD, or any other kind of chronic trauma issues, or highlighted like individual trauma issues. It doesn't have to be chronic. family issues such as divorce, losing one or both parents, or sibling stress. School struggles, such as behavioral issues at school, or ADHD issues, or bullying, or not fitting in, or those kinds of things. Substance abuse in family or in self. Neurodiversity, so if they are on the spectrum, or if they have ADHD, as I mentioned before, or any other kind of learning, both gifted qualities or qualities that make them developmentally slower. Suicide or suicidal ideation, and life stage changes, and that would be going into puberty, or getting their driver's license, or even transitioning from elementary school to middle school to high school. Some of those things can have serious mental health stress on kiddos. All right, next slide, please. Along with those typical mental health concerns, newcomers experience mental health concerns that are even more so, even a highlighter over top of those things. So they experience separation from caregivers throughout the process. This would cause attachment wounds, which comes out as stress and perhaps behavioral problems, or being unable to connect with people, or connecting with people very much, like being very clingy and those kinds of things. Lower socioeconomic status. Typically, they come to America with very little, and so they may experience the stresses of being lower in the socioeconomic class range. Racism, depending on where they come from, they may have racist acts as soon as they enter into the country, or along their path, or who knows when they might experience that. Language barriers and cultural differences. Many times the children learn English before the parents do, and that becomes a whole other kettle of fish, or whatever you'd like to describe it as the children are suddenly the translators, which puts them into this very interesting balance with their parents. Concerns over legal status is also linked to anxiety. Now, most children that come as refugees or newcomers through the organizations that CWS works with are legal and have their documents, but many other children or other immigrants may not be documented, and that really has a lot of concern and creates a lot of anxiety. Social marginalization is linked to depression. So children who are the only people in their school that are from the Ukraine or whatever may be depressed because they have no one else that has similar language, similar cultural experiences than they do. Possible financial, cultural, and emotional caregiving responsibilities that they have to assume for their parents. So just like the language barrier that we discussed, children who are newcomer children who are assimilating more quickly to American culture, they may be assuming some caregiving responsibilities for their parents. So their parents either can't because they don't speak the language, or the language is a barrier and the kids have to help the kids have to help their parents navigate that. When they're on that journey to the US, they are particularly vulnerable to the mental health implications, the children are. And they often have very little choice or control over the matter of them moving to America, and especially when circumstances separate them from their caregivers. Growing up in these complex circumstances puts enormous pressure on the mental health of many newcomer children, and this has far-reaching effects for generations to come. Although stronger government policies are needed to set up a proper tone on immigration, the mental health community has an important role to play in the treatment of immigrants, especially children. Immigrant children younger than 13 years old can be referred to as the 1.5 generation. Their migration story and its effects on their mental health is slightly different than their parents and older siblings. Because they are immersed in US schools at a younger age, the 1.5 generation becomes acculturated much faster. When first generation immigrants might enjoy good mental health, at least in the beginning, the 1.5 kids, that would be younger than 13, are more vulnerable to issues. 75% of newcomer children experience some kind of separation from their parents. Youth who are undocumented, as I mentioned before, are at a higher risk of experiencing anxiety. This risk is even greater among families when the parents are documented, but the children are not. These children will worry that they're going to be sent back to their native country, that they could be separated from their parents. To put this in perspective, about 60% of immigrant Latino youth and their parents lacked documentation when entering the US. In cases that parents had documents, almost 11% of adolescents did not. Okay, next slide, please. Excuse me. All right. Some of the barriers to mental health. As you can see, there's quite a few, and you may have experienced some barriers your own self because, you know, America's not so great sometimes about opening up our healthcare system and encouraging people to get help in their mental health areas. They're very common, and they're varied, though, across ethnic groups. The most common barrier is lack of insurance. Others include stigma around mental health, cost, language. For instance, when I worked with refugee families, I had to have a translator with me, and we lined up that translator through the organization that I worked with. And so I'm trying to understand and do mental health assessments and mental health counseling, but through a translator, which is a very different experience than being able to talk one-on-one with someone. And there's so much that we can miss in the language, and there's so much that the translator might miss when they're translating. And so the language can be a huge barrier. Distrust of formal services. This can be really hard depending on what their experience has been, either with doctors or with the whole immigration experience. The distrust of people, whether or not, what's this lady here for, or this man, or this person? Why do they want to talk to me? Why are they asking me about my mental health or my child's mental health? This can be a very hard thing to trust. We have a hard time trusting when we speak the language and we are from somewhere. They may be embarrassed that they can't handle the problem themselves. Americans are the same way, sometimes some Americans. Cultural incompetence. For instance, if the therapist doesn't understand the language, they may also not understand the culture, or they might not understand what it might mean to be from a particular place. Inaccessibility, being undocumented, the lack of knowledge, perception of what it means to get mental health. All of these things are huge barriers to what someone might seek mental health for. Considering the amount of potential stress involved in the migration story, it may be surprising to note that immigrants rarely seek out professional mental services. A 2015 systemic review of 62 articles found that only 6% of Asian and Latino immigrants had ever received mental health care. Instead, immigrants were more likely to seek out informal care from family, friends, and religious leaders in their social networks, which is great if someone feels comfortable talking about them, as if those people feel like they can be supportive and they feel confident that they can give the person the care that they need. And that can be one of the great things about being involved as a supportive person from the organization that you might be from. Maybe you know of these leaders that would be really helpful and great for them to connect with. Maybe you're in connection with the family and friends that can help provide support because you are known in the community and you're connected with these families. One study of Korean immigrants found that 52% preferred to seek assistance from family and friends, 40% preferred religious consultation, and only 9% actually sought out a mental health professional. Another study found that 15% of Mexican immigrants sought psychiatric help, as opposed to 38% of US-born Mexicans with similar problems. One study found that more than half the immigrant families spoke a language other than English at home, and despite there being several US laws requiring access to interpretation services, barely half of hospitals provide them. So this is a problem for actual healthcare as well as mental health care or any kind of healthcare. And that situation doesn't seem to be improving very much. A lot of times, mental health confidentiality is something that newcomers don't understand. The confidentiality between a counselor or a doctor and the child might be unacceptable to some parents. They don't understand why the doctor isn't telling them everything that the kid is saying or what they might be needing to talk about. Children of immigrants often financially and emotionally support their parents during difficult times in an unforgiving US system that can leave them without a federally mandated living wage, accessible healthcare, and affordable housing. They often serve as cultural and language brokers, as we've mentioned, for their family's collective survival at home and at work. Parents also, on top of that, often set high expectations for their children to succeed, given their own incredible sacrifices, including migration. So the children of immigrants feel incredible pressure to elevate their families and support them and have a better life, which makes it even harder to seek help if you are held to this really high standard. All right, next slide, please. So this is the good news. I found this really cute little drawing was written by a kiddo who was a Latino newcomer, and it's in the references. But he said the things that were good about him being an immigrant in America, and this is particularly in school. He cited these things were his strengths and what he brought to the table and other people bring to the table, and that is the immigrant optimism, models of strong work ethic, value and hopeful about the benefits of education, cohesive extended families, bilingual advantages, socio-emotional advantage, cognitive flexibility and perspective taking, ability to code switch and navigate between cultures, and experience adapting to new conditions. Despite all the challenges that newcomers go through, many push forward and succeed, outperforming both native citizens and established immigrants while reporting lower rates of depression and anxiety. Compared to US natives, immigrants have a lower risk over their lifetime of developing a psychiatric condition such as anxiety, mood, or substance use disorders. That does change for their children and for the longer that their children are in America. It seems like first generation immigrants and the children they bring with them are more resilient than the people that are born here. And they tend to be right alongside people that were born in America as far as developing psychiatric conditions or mental health symptoms. One study suggests that strong family ties, cultural strength, religion, and migrant social networks provide protections. Another study suggests that selective migration as an influence, which favors immigrants who represent a smaller yet healthier subset within a population, one that shows above average resilience, motivation, and psychological well-being may be one of the reasons why that's true. Next slide, please. How can we help? So one of the first things that we want to know when we see these kinds of things like, oh, people stressing, how can we help them, right? How can we help the families that we interact with? How can we help support them? Validating their experience is one of the major ways that you can help the families. You can validate them by letting the children that they are not alone in their experience. Helping them navigate two cultures is difficult. Sometimes just expressing that you understand and normalizing whatever emotion they might be experiencing can be really helpful. The racial ethnic socialization, helping children understand and value their culture and family background. For example, if a child is quickly assimilating into America and trying to leave behind their family's culture that they brought with them, that actually will be harmful for them in the long run. They need to walk that very fine line of being able to say, I love the culture I've come from, this is important to me, these things are important to me, and also learning how to be an American is important to me. Because that shows the people that can learn how to walk that fine line and balance those two cultures that they are living in will be more successful in life and will have less stress with their mental health. Social and family connections. Developing close family ties and social networks within the newcomer or immigrant community has been shown to protect children's mental health by providing that natural support structure. So while they've left behind, or maybe never knew if they were born in America, a culture of their home country and all their family and all their friends that are still there, they can grow that social and family connection in America. And that's important also to walking that line. Bilingualism. Research shows the benefits of biculturalism and bilingualism in the home to preserve immigrant strengths. Advocate for system changes. Children and adolescents of immigrants are less likely to seek mental health treatment. This is because of systemic barriers that we talked about before And it can be really helpful for us as the more privileged, supportive Americans to help advocate for changes in the system to support these families. And you can support the families in conversation about mental health. If families are facing some of those barriers, much harder to talk to them about money issues, or, yeah, the government isn't very great at supporting you to getting this help. But being able to say, okay, so in your country, yes, you're saying that it wasn't okay to talk to so-and-so or to seek outside help for issues. Well, in America, we kind of think it's okay, and we're trying to make it more okay. And these are the reasons why it might be helpful. So children especially might need an advocate to help go to their parents and say, hey, I'm struggling in school. Can you help me talk to my parents about why I might need some more help? And that's a place that would be really great, that you could possibly, also walking a fine line because you want to maintain the relationship with the family, but you can advocate for the children in a way that can help them get the help they might need. So along those lines, as more ways that you can help are your own personal responsibilities. So we can grow our own cultural competency. If you're working with a family, it's important for you to be able to know, okay, these people are this, their culture might be this. We're not expecting, no one is expecting anyone to suddenly become an expert in whatever kind of culture, but to at least have some more understanding so that if you're talking to the family about mental health or whatever else, that you are showing up in the best place that you can. And as mentioned, supporting when issues arise. If you can also actively collaborate with other providers in the community and offer some resources to the children and the parents, and that would one, take some of the stress off the kids that might be caring for their parents, and it can also open doors of resources for support. Become familiar with some of the typical and atypical mental health symptoms. We kind of highlighted some of the typical and ones that only newcomers might see. And so if you aren't familiar with like anxiety, depression, what suicidal ideation might be, like all those kinds of things, it's really helpful if you're going to be, working with people in any way to kind of know what those look like. One of the ways that I was able to go through and find that out before I even was, finishing my degree that I have in this was mental health first aid, and they offer workshops that help train people in knowing how to see these symptoms of pretty basic mental health stresses and mental health symptoms and what to do in the moment. It's like CPR, but for mental health, and it can be really helpful, and people offer them all over the world. And so if you are interested in learning more about that and how to support those people, I would recommend trying to find those places. And then reporting when needed. Now, this is a sticky wicket, as I say, because especially if you're working with a family that's undocumented or is still going through the process, it can be really hard to know what to do with this. We want to protect the children, we want to protect the families, but we also want to protect the children and we want to protect the families. And so in this case, my recommendation, if you see something that might need to be reported, like domestic violence or a child that's being neglected or abused, that's when I think it would be important to go to whoever the head of the organization is that you are working with. Talk to them about it first. See if they have a case manager or a caseworker that you can talk to or that they can talk to, so that we are trying to support and help the family first before, calling Child Protective Services and then blowing up their whole family. And there is a time and a place for Child Protective Services, absolutely. But I think in this case of education and trying to help people to be better families and support the children better, that talking to your supervisor and then talking to the caseworker and talking to those people first, bringing them into the loop and helping these families be educated and assisted in those ways is probably the best thing to start with. The next part is when children or an adolescent have suicidal ideation or self-injury, or they're doing a lot of school refusal or those kinds of things like that. That is another time when I would definitely seek professional guidance, either calling a therapist if they're expressing suicidal ideation or self-injury. Definitely involve the caseworker, probably making a trip to the hospital if they have a plan. This is not something that you want to mess around with, in my opinion. this is not something that you want to sleep on or try to wait. That doesn't mean that everything has to be a crisis and an emergency, but it definitely needs to be met with seriousness that it deserves. Even if you seem like it's a cry for help or they don't seem very intentional, it is always important to treat it seriously. And so being able to seek an outside referral or behavioral services is really important, maybe even involving the school counselor, whatever sources, whatever you can do to kind of put a family and a team around this person or these people that need more support and help. Whatever you can do there to help is good. And especially because these things can come with a lot of shame. And so if you treat it seriously and you're also not like, oh no, we cannot talk about this, then you're saying, oh, this is important and we need to take care of it, as opposed to don't talk about it, let's not do that. So those would be my professional opinions about what to do in those situations. All right, and if we want to go to slide 9. And this is our references slide. So these are the references that I use to put together this. I'm sure Derek and Grace, you guys can probably send them out if anybody is wanting to do any more deep dives into the research that I dove into myself to make sure that I was backing up my knowledge with some numbers. And yeah, so I think that about wraps it up. So if you want to go to the last slide, and that would be my thank you. Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to help with our newcomer families to walk this really hard, sometimes, life of getting used to mental health struggles and what it's like to navigate that in America.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, we're going to move to begin answering any questions that are submitted in the questions box. I don't see any just yet, but you still can submit some questions. We still have a little bit of time. If you go, you can submit questions through the questions panes in your attendee control panel. I have a couple of, or at least one follow-up question as we wait, just in case anyone else wants to add to that. But that was so, and you touched on it very well. Just the sensitivity to issues related to when to report or things like that if there are particular concerns. But how about just generally, how would you recommend people, when they're working with a family, if they're seeing something like that appears to be similar symptoms to depression or anxiety or something, not as serious as that somehow, it doesn't feel like it's in the realm of, having to call Child Protective Services. It doesn't feel like it's in the realm of like an emergency, like someone is actively suicidal. But just sort of generally, if they're seeing some things that, to suggest that, yeah, there is some significant sadness, depression, anxiety, perhaps, things like that. What are some recommendations that a volunteer or sponsor who's working with clients, to kind of take some steps of action? What kinds of things would you recommend? I know you had mentioned some things like validating their experience for them, but yeah, what are some other sort of steps that you might?
Yeah, so in that kind of scenario, I would first recommend attempting to talk to the parents about it, right? Because they're typically supposed to be the first line of support, right? And so whether they have noticed it or not, or you can see if they're on the same page, if they're even open to talking about it, if the kiddo is even open to talking about it with their parents. These are important things to figure out, because the parents are also going to have to sign off on anything else that goes forward. So I think that being able to say, hey, I've noticed that Antoine is really sad and he's been crying a lot lately, and he hasn't been eating when we've had dinners together, or he's seems really down, and he was really cheerful when I first met you guys, and now he just seems really sad, and he just doesn't seem like himself. So I'm curious if you guys notice that, and what do you think, and do you guys need some help finding out how to help Antoine, right? And so that would be my first thing to do. And depending on the parents' answer, if they're like, oh yeah, he is really sad, we notice that too, and his teachers have even said that he's not hanging out with his friends and he's just not happy. He doesn't seem very happy anymore. And then if they're on board, then say, well, look, maybe we can work together to see what we can do to support him. What are some options? Well, let's talk to the organization. Let's see if they have a mental health person on their staff or under contract, or someone that they know that already speaks language or that has a translator or whatever, so that we can have that. If they don't, then maybe you reach out to local therapy organizations, whether it's through, there's usually some online, there's like Facebook organizations, a friend therapist that you might have, and say, hey, friend therapist, or someone I know that's a therapist or a counselor, or school counselor. Here is, I know this kid, he speaks whatever, he's really depressed. Do you have any suggestions of someone that might be able to see him? And then they can perhaps have some referrals for you. If not, then from there, then you are on a greater hunt and a greater search, and you will be probably asking lots of people lots of questions to find some help. But there's also the possibilities of going to other people in the community, if you have the family's permission, and saying, hey, we've all noticed Anton's a little sad. What would you do in your culture? How would you discuss this if you were at home in wherever? Would this be something you would be worried about? And if it is or isn't, how do we navigate that together? So then you're collaborating with them instead of taking that position of power and being like, I know what's best for you, you're going to do this, right? So anytime that you can collaborate with the family and bring them on board, especially through all of this process when they haven't been the expert on much of anything, when they're showing up and learning how to be Americans for the first time. How do I ride a bus? How do I do this? You're collaborating with them and saying your experience and what you have done in your culture is important in this especially for your kiddo. So how can we come alongside and work together to help Antoine, right? And so maybe they are religious, and talking to their pastor would be really helpful. And if that works, then that's really great. Or if there's someone in the community that is also really, really wonderful and supportive and a great mentor, and maybe you connect them with Anton, or maybe you help them understand what Anton needs. So those would be the things that I would think about.
That's great. Yeah, and that's fine. I don't see any more questions in the chat, which is totally fine. Sometimes people have questions, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they watch the video afterwards. But we are, getting to the end of our time. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Leslie. Thank you so much. And to everyone here for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. Grace, please go to the next slide. We would like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn, and to hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. That's really always important to us as well. We ask that you take a moment now to complete a survey. Use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat. Grace will add that to the chat as well, and we look forward to hearing from you. Everyone here will receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. And just wanted to say, on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Leslie. Really appreciate your time and effort today, and the very informative presentation.
Thank you for having me.